What the Speak, episode 14. Whoa, take it easy with those slide animations.
Do you kick ass when you speak, present, or pitch? If not, these expert discussions and insider tips can help you right now, today. Welcome to the What the Speak podcast. I'm your host, Brian Kelly.
If you've never seen the story behind how and why the What the Speak podcast got started, visit whatthespeak.com/speakbetter to watch the 90-second video. If you like what you see, send the link to someone you know. My guest, Scott Schwertly, is the CEO and founder of a company called Ethos3 that creates some of the most enviable slide presentation decks you'll ever see. He's also the author of How to Be a Presentation God. We talk about some simple tips that you can begin using today, yes, today, to help you create better looking slides, and you don't have to be a graphic designer. We also talk about an award-winning presentation that Scott's company created a few years back titled Meet Henry. This is a unique presentation that will give you a different perspective on how you create your slides and really the content that goes into what those slides are representing. Well, Scott, it is awesome to have you here. I'm really thrilled to talk about your experiences as someone who really understands content development for presentations as well as tying in stunning visuals. So thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. Appreciate the opportunity.
Now, I know a couple of years, maybe a few years ago now, you rocked the presentation world, so to speak, with your Presentation Revolution Manifesto. And since then, I think we've seen a lot of people really paying attention to how their slides are being designed, but also how they're actually developing the content for those slides and not just putting bullets on a slide and saying, here's point A, here's point B, here's point C. So really eager to get your perspective. Also, I know that you are kind of one of the individuals behind an award-winning slide deck called Meet Henry, which we'll talk about in just a minute. So really, the first question I have for you, Scott, is how did you get into presentation design, and what's the story behind that in your company Ethos3?
Yeah, a great question. We've been around for about 7 years, and if you were to ask me in high school or college, if you would ask me if I was actually to be ever involved in presentations as a career, I would have had no idea that this was actually where I would end up being. But I really sort of just stumbled across it. I've always had a passion for presentations and public speaking, and enjoyed it in junior high, enjoyed it in high school. Definitely loved giving presentations during grad school for some of my MBA courses, but again, never really thought I'd make a career of it. And actually, as I worked in the marketing sector for a good amount of years, I think actually worked about 4 or 5 years in the marketing sector, I realized that a lot of my peers struggled with presentations. Even those below me and above me struggled with public speaking and presenting. And not only from a design standpoint where their slides would look ugly, but also just not a real strong understanding. You know what? There's an alarm behind me.
That's okay. No problem. We'll just roll with it.
Perfect. There's a fire truck going by. But as I mentioned, everybody really just struggled with presentations, not only designing it, but building it, creating a narrative, delivering it, pretty much every component surrounding presentations. And so really just the idea of Ethos3 was really sort of one of those shower moments. And I thought, hey, I should actually create a company and make meaning somehow by focusing my time on presentations, and basically started working on it on my nights and weekends and finally got it up and running. And looking back, it's been a great 7 years. And it's interesting, I look at my company now, and we mainly pump out presentation design projects. And I'm not a designer. I never went to design school. I know a little bit about Photoshop. I know a little bit about Illustrator. But I've sort of allowed myself to really sort of surround myself with artists and others that, have that skill set. But it's still great being able to work day in and day out and actually focus on the art of presentations. My skill set typically is more on the narrative, the story side of things, and it's fun to be able to be exposed to that every single day. So having a blast.
Well, the thing that I think is really cool about what you guys do is you've certainly elevated the game. I think a lot more people are paying attention to how their slides look, but the fact that the impact that you've had is really on how we think about crafting the content for the presentation. So I've got a few questions that we'll dig into that a little bit further. But first, I did want to explore this idea of presentation design just a little bit more with you.
Yes.
So for those of us that, again, and like yourself, being somebody that's not necessarily a designer, by education, what are some simple tips that you might recommend somebody if they're going to open up PowerPoint or Keynote on their computer today to do a presentation for next week? What are just some simple things that you might be able to share that would help?
One of the basic things is, obviously, if you struggle with designing presentations, probably one of your biggest struggles is, maybe defaulting to putting too much text on a slide, maybe defaulting to things like bullet points. And so one of the easiest things that you can do as a non-designer is really just sort of, instead of opting for 3 bullet points, opt for 3 separate slides, and embracing the whole idea of big imagery, minimal text. It's a really simple, easy thing to implement. And again, you don't have to be a rock star at Photoshop or Illustrator to be able to pull that off. So it's simply finding an image on a royalty-free site like iStockphoto.com or Fotolia.com or any of the other ones that are out there, downloading the image, dropping it in PowerPoint, adding some text on top of it, and that's going to look far more engaging and far more visually appealing than any sort of PowerPoint template, text-heavy bullet point slide. So definitely would offer that up. And I also tend to be a big advocate of lynda.com, Lynda. If somebody has a passion for wanting to learn more about presentation design, plenty of books obviously written on the topic, but also if you have a passion for learning Photoshop or Illustrator or some other program, jump on lynda.com, take a few courses, and learn how to do some of the more, complicated, more complex tasks. So, yeah. But yeah, anybody should feel empowered to start building better presentations without the extensive software knowledge.
Well, it's interesting. Right before we started recording, you and I were talking about a conference I was at last week. And when I went to some of the various sessions, you could see the presenters who just were kind of bullet. And then there were sessions where I went and people were really starting to understand this concept of, subject or a heading, something that captures the essence of what that point is that they're trying to make, a nice big visual. Again, it's not something that's like overly designed, but it has a lot more impact and allows me to get the essence of what is trying to be communicated, but pay attention to the presenter versus being distracted with reading a bunch of text on the slide. So exactly. Great. Those are some really helpful tips. And to give you a plug, one of the books that you guys should check out is Scott's book called How to Be a Presentation God. All right. So now I would love to discuss with you really, let's take a peek behind the curtain, so to speak, for your presentation, Meet Henry. Mm-hmm. So Meet Henry, and we'll include a link to this in the show notes here, but Meet Henry was designed for SlideShare. So I'd love to have you talk a little bit about that medium and why you guys designed this slide deck in a certain way for that. And then also, I know that there's a recording out there on YouTube of you giving a live presentation where you kind of started off with using Meet Henry as kind of the introduction to that and setting up what you guys do at Ethos3. So I'd love to talk with you about that. What was the reason behind Meet Henry and how did that come about?
Yeah, it's funny. Meet Henry has done wonders for just our business in general. I mean, it's brought a lot of awareness to Ethos3 and what we're all about. And, looking at the design now, it's definitely something we wouldn't necessarily pump out today. From a design perspective, I think there's a lot of storytelling elements that we would still utilize. But, looking back, that was 7 years ago or maybe even 6 years ago. And at the time, it was completely sort of cutting edge. I mean, nobody else was doing something like that. And I really think what sort of separated it apart from the others is, thinking back, this was actually SlideShare's sort of first kickoff for the world's best presentation contest. And, I was looking at some of the competition that was, sort of being submitted at the time, and everybody was submitting your typical sort of death by PowerPoint deck. So as you mentioned, a lot of the headers, the bullets, text heavy type stuff. And so, really the objective with that contest was to submit something that really could just stand on its own and would encourage and inspire somebody to want to sort of click and sort of click through it on their own. And so as I was thinking about the story and as I was thinking about the narrative, I wanted to do something that would allow, keep somebody engaged for, 30 seconds or a minute of their time to allow them to do that. And that's really where Henry was born. And So I created the idea of Henry the character and Erica the character, and it sort of just came alive from that standpoint. And the amazing thing is that storytelling style, which I guess I would classify as sort of like a user experience story, is still a style and structure that we use today in most of the corporate decks that we work on day in and day out. So that's really sort of the genesis of Henry. It was really just trying to do something different that was a little bit different than the status quo. And I guess more importantly in that was easy to click through and would guarantee somebody would go from, slide 1 to slide 54.
Yeah, I mean, it's when you go back and you look at it, I think the thing that really stands out to me is that, like you said, you set it up in a way that's really, it makes you want to keep going through the deck if you're there on SlideShare looking at it. But then, seeing how you use it in a live setting, like it sets the tone right out of the get-go from like, here's who we are, here's why we're different, and we're telling you so through this really interesting story. And kind of, you've got the hero, you've got like a doppelganger, you've got a villain, so to speak, all those story elements which really make it compelling. And so, I would really be curious to dig in a little bit more and ask you, like, how did you come about thinking through, like, okay, we're going to create this guy named Henry, and he's got these set of characteristics, and then we've got Erica, who's got these set of characteristics. Is there any insights that you can give us as we think about developing our own stories?
Yeah, I mean, definitely from that, it's got sort of that protagonist, antagonist sort of approach. And, that always works well. I mean, it works well in Hollywood, and it also works well within presentations. And also being able to share, to state a challenge, a solution, and not just state it through facts and stats. I think that just the concept of creating a human element by creating maybe a fictional character, or maybe even some decks actually using real life, case studies or true stories. But adding that human element, I think, does wonders in it. Again, it makes the information just easy to understand. I know story is a big buzzword these days, but I mean, as humans, that's how we sort of connect and communicate. And so if you can put information into a story form, obviously that's really what's going to work for an audience, and making sure that your message gets remembered. I think that's really just where it came from, is just applying some basic storytelling principles to make that thing work.
Well, that's a good segue into the next question I had for you was, what are the 3 storytelling approaches that you typically recommend? Can you walk through those with us?
Oh, yeah, definitely. In fact, I actually just did a guest blog post on SlideShare regarding this topic. 3 that I would actually recommend. Number 1 would probably be a visual metaphor. There's always a better way to sort of present your information. So I'm a big fan of visual metaphors. Maybe a fancier way for explaining that would be, maybe just developing a theme for your presentation. So, find that visual metaphor that you feel is going to work best for your audience, where, again, you don't necessarily have to be so facts and stats heavy with your approach. So that'd be probably one recommendation. The second recommendation would be very much like the Meet Henry style. Maybe find a user experience story. So find a true character, a fictional character, whatever you want to use there, but again, find that human element and let your message essentially come to the surface through the vehicle of a character. And then probably the third would be, I happen to be a real big fan of tension and discovery, where kind of like Jaws, you don't really see the great white shark until the very end of the movie, and it's constantly creating that format of tension and problems and chaos, and then finally you have that aha moment or that discovery moment at the end. And that style, again, sort of really works well in Hollywood. And again, that also works well within presentations. And then probably a fourth, I'll just throw this in there as a bonus, is the heroic journey. Everybody loves a good hero story. The Henry deck sort of had an element of that through the Erica character. But everybody loves a hero story. You love Luke Skywalker. You love Rocky Balboa. Everybody loves the hero. If you can format your presentation in that way, it should work as well.
Love it. Well, good. Thanks for the bonus.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's say I'm just getting started and I'm really dialing into what you're talking about with telling a story through my presentation and that narrative. Now, I know I'm not going to go out tomorrow and be a fantastic storyteller, but what are some of the beginning things that I can do to begin incorporating ways to tell a story and to tell that story in an engaging way? Any tips there?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think even beyond, you're right. I mean, there is no overnight pill that anyone can take that they're going to wake up tomorrow morning and be a great storyteller. In fact, actually just came back from a training session where I sort of talk about 4 training umbrellas: content, how you build it; design, how you design it; delivery, how you deliver it; and then storytelling, obviously, harnessing the power of storytelling. And I'm very clear to mention that, when you think about content, when you think about design, when you think about delivery, they're a little bit subjective, but at the end of the day, they're sort of objective tasks. Content, you can always add this transition sentence. Design, you can always tweak this color. Delivery, you can practice a little bit more. Pretty objective. But storytelling is definitely the most subjective of those 4 umbrellas. Again, you can't wake up tomorrow morning and be this fantastic, astounding sort of storyteller. It just does not happen. And so, all I can recommend is, read the books, practice, experiment, test out things, fail quickly. If you're going to be speaking at a local event, take a stab at telling a personal story or, the story of your product or your service, and take some risks. But again, you just got to keep experimenting. I wish there was some quick formula or some quick fix, and there really isn't, just because it is so subjective. I think for half the people out there, they catch on and they can think of those cool visual metaphors. They can think of those really cool heroic type stories. And for others, they're going to struggle with it. And again, I think just practicing, getting out there, just like anything else in life, you just got to keep throwing yourself out there and find a rhythm that's going to work for you.
Well, and I think it's also interesting to understand that if you're going this new direction and you want to get away from the standard, bullet point list and just kind of going through facts and figures, that little tweak, that little adjustment to maybe tell a quick little personal story or some other metaphor for setting up like what it is that you're going to be diving into is going to have a tremendous impact compared to if you just would have done it the same old standard way that most everybody else is approaching presentations in the business world still, unfortunately, today.
Yeah, definitely. And for whatever it's worth, too, I know Chip and Dan Heath have their book Made to Stick, which I know was super popular a few years ago. And, they talk a lot about storytelling in that book. And, one thing that really resonated with me from that is, they talk about that if you share facts and stats, your audience is going to react in one of 2 ways. Reaction number 1 is they're going to agree with you, and they'll say, keep preaching it. I love to hear what you have to say. And if they don't agree with you, they're going to have reaction 2, which is they're going to disagree. And they'll put up a wall, and you'll make no headway. But the thing with storytelling is if you actually tell a story during your presentation, people don't agree or disagree. They actually participate with you. And so I think that's the greatest lesson. If anybody's obviously skeptic about trying to embrace storytelling, just understand your audience is going to participate with you. And that's probably one of the best things you can get. It's one of the best results you can get from giving a presentation. So highly recommend it. Again, takes a lot of practice, but you can ultimately get there.
Great. All right, Scott. Well, we've got a minute or 2 left, and I'd love to ask you a question that might be a bit of a curveball, but what's the one thing that you wish you knew when you started presenting that you know now today?
Great question. I think my thing would be, I had one of my mentors tell me this quite some time ago before I even started Ethos3, and it's you got to always basically know your audience. And that sounds really simplistic, but there's a little bit more that I want to just sort of elaborate on. In every audience situation, you're always going to have a 50-50 balance of introverts and extroverts. And I don't want to beat the subject to death, but basically you have to pretend like you've got a battery in the middle of your chest. If you're an introvert, if you're in a social setting, that battery gets depleted. If you're by yourself, it gets charged. Extrovert, you're the opposite of that. And so really the main lesson there is, I tend to be an introvert, so I tend to be a processor. It'd be to my detriment to immediately give feedback on certain topics, where it'd be to my benefit to take time to digest it and sort of organize the material in my head. So how that relates to the presentation scenario is that I'm never going to randomly call upon somebody in my audience, because there's a 50% chance I'm going to call upon an introvert, and they're going to hate my guts for it because they don't have time to process the information. Also, with that said, I'm not going to ever be lecture-based the entire time during a talk, because extroverts want time for interaction and exercise and feedback and all that. So, I think a lot of presenters get stuck in the trap of they lean in one direction, and they either become too lecture-based or they become too much fun with just too many exercises and not enough substance. And so I think that's probably one of the lessons I wish I would have learned a long time ago, is that you got to really pay attention to your audience and their needs, their wishes, and understanding that simple balance between introverts and extroverts, and that you're going to have that healthy balance in your audience allow you to hopefully set up your message and your content in such a way that you're going to win on both sides.
That's a great insight. So thanks so much for that, Scott. And it was great to hear the story behind Ethos3 and some of the other things that you've done. So appreciate you coming on the show today.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. Appreciate it.
Alrighty. Bye-bye.
All right, bye-bye.
If you liked what today's guest had to share in our discussion, you may want to grab an audio copy of their latest book for free by going to WTSaudiobook.com. That's WTSaudiobook.com.
All right, here we go with the outro.
Thanks so much for joining us today on What to Speak. Be sure to visit whattospeak.com for show notes on every episode and to sign up for our email list to stay updated on resources that'll help you kick ass when you speak, present, or pitch.